Welcome back to History for Hours. Tonight, we drift into the late-night streets of New York, where storefront lights hum softly and danger hides behind polite smiles. This is the world of Nicholas Corozzo, a man who didn't chase attention but quietly commanded it, where power was exercised with subtlety, not spectacle, and respect was earned through presence alone. Most people couldn't survive a life like this, not because of violence, but because it demanded patience, calculation, and the ability to speak softly while holding unseen authority. Before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you genuinely enjoy these long, slow journeys through history's darker corners. And if you're listening right now, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love knowing where these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, let the city noise fade, and settle in as we ease into the quiet, calculating story of Nicholas Corozzo. The night Nicholas first learned the difference between a loud life and a long one, he stood under a sodium street lamp and watched the city breathe. It was late enough for the noise to have thinned, but early enough for the machines to hum like a steady heart. People hurried by with small, urgent faces. Sirens threaded the distance like distant metronomes. Nicholas felt, very clearly, that most drama wants applause. Longevity, he thought even then, prefers the dark, where it can do its work without being watched. He was born into a neighborhood that taught two contradictory truths at once, that everybody mattered and that only the careful ones thrived. Families kept their ledgers in battered notebooks. Favors were recorded in memory and repaid with the kind of punctuality that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with dignity. You could measure a man there by the things he returned on time and by the quiet consistency of his visits. Nicholas learned the rules without being told. He learned to notice the small things that break the loudest lives, the unpaid week, the hastily broken promise, the favor that evaporated when opportunity arrived. As a boy, he shadowed older men who seemed to perform authority without announcing it. He watched how they held space at a table, the slight lean that suggested listening, the way a single well-timed question could rearrange argument into solution. He learned, too, how errors were mended, not with spectacle, but with repair. Fixes were discreet. When someone's credit faltered, a neighbor found a way to cover a day. When a driver's truck failed, another handed over a spare tire and a quiet apology for the inconvenience. The neighborhood operated as a clockwork of small mercies, and Nicholas liked the engineering of it. Work found him in modest steps. He began by running errands, hauling crates from a warehouse that smelled of oil and cardboard, learning the geometry of the city by the routes that always annoyed traffic. He learned which bridges choke during certain hours, which alleys are short and which are narrow, who backs out of a deal and who keeps every promise even when it costs them. He kept his eyes open and his mouth closed. People trusted him because he arrived and because he remembered. Trust, he decided, was less about grand gestures and more about being the person who did what they said they would. There were nights when the neighborhood hissed with caution, whispers about men who wanted to change the rules, investors who mentioned efficiency with bright slides and empty promises. Nicholas watched those men carefully. Efficiency in the wrong hands meant speed without repair, a quick thinning of human margins where profit outpaced patience. He liked good ideas. He liked progress. He distrusted any promise that trimmed the safety nets without accounting for the people standing on them. So he learned the language of compromise, how to translate a neat plan into a human-ready one that included buffers and fallback. He became someone who could take a bright idea and ask, "Who eats if this fails next month?" His gifts were subtle, an unhurried presence, an eye for detail, a memory like a ledger that refused to lose entries. He would appear at odd hours with small solutions, a driver rerouted so a baker could meet payroll, a paperwork push that freed a stuck invoice, a discreet call that calmed a supplier's impatience. These acts didn't make headlines, they made mornings. People started to mention his name, not loudly, but in a way that meant if trouble came, Nicholas would be a man to call. As his network grew, so did the complexity of the choices before him. Men with capital arrived, offering modernization, new hubs, slick platforms that promised to match shipments to drivers in milliseconds. Their graphs glittered under office lights, and their words smelled of progress. Nicholas listened. He did not hate technology. He understood that tools could free people from drudgery. But he also knew that tools carry their own logic. An algorithm that optimizes only for cost can treat people like variables. And when a variable is a family's rent, optimization without care becomes cruelty. He began to insist on pilots, small tests, human overrides, escrowed funds to bridge mistakes. He learned to ask for terms that protected mornings when the models failed. The first pilot he convinced a cautious investor to try was modest, a condensed delivery window for non-perishables. Goods, with a clause that ensured immediate support if a driver's hours were unexpectedly cut. It ran bumpy at first, not because the tech was bad, but because human rhythms rarely fit neatly into someone else's idealized timetable. Drivers missed their kids' school runs when routes changed overnight. Shopkeepers could not accept afternoon deliveries because their clerks finished early. Nicholas asked simple questions. Who takes care of the driver's child if her hours change? And the pilot adapted. It did well enough to keep moving forward, and that success began to change the room slightly. Engineers listened to drivers. Investors learned that buffers cost money, but also cost less than strikes and boycotts. With small successes came attention. Some men wanted to accelerate. They saw scale as the answer. Nicholas saw risk. Scale without the right scaffolding shifts burdens to the weakest shoulders. He found himself in more rooms than he liked, rooms with glass windows where decisions echoed into other neighborhoods. He kept his voice low and his points precise. If you want speed, he would say, name the failure mode and show me who pays when it happens. Sometimes they liked his bluntness. Sometimes they called it an obstacle. But his insistence on naming the cost became a habit the room learned to account for or to avoid. There were personal costs to that habit. Saying no to a fast profit sometimes meant losing access to capital that could fix real problems. There were nights of small resentments, voices who had expected him to fold, who had looked to him as a permit for their haste. He accepted some losses as the tuition of stewardship. He learned to build allies instead of enemies by offering partial solutions, phased rollouts, retraining funds, and binding escrow accounts. These were small, legal bones that could be leaned on when storms arrived. Storms did arrive, not always in thunder. A sudden dock strike, a mistaken algorithmic reassignment that delayed hundreds of deliveries, a greedy newcomer offering higher pay for drivers at the cost of long, unsustainable hours. Each incident tested the structures Nicholas had pushed for. He did the work he had always done: call people, deploy funds, reroute drivers, and patch systems before panic could take root. He organized an emergency pool seeded by investors who had learned that the escrow was cheaper than reputational damage. He taught apprentices, people like Marco and Lucia, to ask the hard, useful questions and to act with the steady calm that made quick fixes reliable. At night, in the quiet between chores, he kept a small notebook. Not ledgers for money, those resided elsewhere, but names and small promises. Who had a child with a test the next week? Which bakery preferred deliveries at dawn? Who agreed to loan a truck for a day if needed? The list looked insignificant until it mattered. Then every entry felt like a lifeline. The notebook was less about control and more about connection. He cultivated relationships so that when a crisis occurred, the right person could be reached without drama. Slowly, a culture formed around these habits. Apprentices learned to make repair the default. Investors began to accept contractual protections as part of the cost of doing business in that neighborhood. The platform developers who once thought papers were slow began to see the value of a human override when a route meant a parent missing a child's only recital. It was not a clean conversion. The world still loved speed and headlines, but the neighborhood built enough muscle to ensure that scale arrived with clauses and that growth meant fewer people left behind. Nicholas did not crave recognition. He preferred the steady work of making mornings happen. Sometimes, though, he allowed himself to imagine being older and leaving the binders and ledgers to people who would extend the practice elsewhere. The sea of small acts, he thought, could be taught and taught again. He hoped the apprentices would carry more than techniques. They would carry the questions. Who pays when it fails, and how can we arrange to mend it quickly without spectacle? One evening, after a long day of negotiations and a minor equipment failure that had been patched by a late-night favor, Nicholas walked a route he had known since childhood. The street smelled of oil and coffee. An elderly woman watered a window box. A young father pushed a stroller with determined patience. He felt, in a quiet place under his ribs, the modest joy of a life that kept things intact. He had traded some narrow comforts for a work that mattered. The ledger in his head was heavy in good ways, names that signaled responsibility, not power. The next months unfurled like a careful machine being wound, steady, deliberate, full of teeth that had to mesh perfectly or else the whole thing jammed. Nicholas settled into the peculiar architecture he'd begun building, part human habit, part written rule, part stubborn litany of small, enforceable promises. The neighborhood changed around him the way a city changes a street, slowly, sometimes painfully, but always with unexpected grace when people paid attention. He spent mornings where he always had, at the coffee cart on the corner that knew how he liked his cup, by the hardware store that kept the same crooked bell. He let the rhythm of small things remind him of what the large things were for. Pilots bloomed and retracted. Meetings happened above glass and under dim fluorescence. The platform updated its software. The hub opened input lines, and the escrow balance occasionally bobbed like a buoy in the tide. Used, then replenished, then audited. Each use was a lesson, each replenishment a test of commitment. He'd taught the apprentices how to read the here and now like a map. Marco watched patterns in routes, the little choices drivers made that made schedules keepable. Lucia could pick apart a clause in a contract and show how it either protected or exposed a person in a week of trouble. Rosa, if she did not yet have the title some wanted to give her, had the diplomatic sense to sit with a driver and a shop owner and make both of them feel heard. Nicholas sent them into rooms and watched them return with answers that fit the human scale. That measured delegation pleased him more than praise. It meant the habit was spreading. A challenge came small and squeaky at first, like a stuck hinge, and then louder when it was ignored. A startup that had once courted the neighborhood with bright slides showed up again, now flush with new capital and a shiny pitch about efficiency at scale. They offered drivers bonuses to sign away certain scheduling privileges, no childcare constraints, flexible mandatory hours, a promise of quick acceptance into high-paying runs. The money glittered in the eyes of men who had real bills, the kind of money that sings to any wallet in a tight month. Nicholas felt the pull, but not for himself. He watched the drivers' faces when the men with slides described a future where algorithms optimized routes and people would just show up. It sounded clean. It sounded like the world in which nothing broke. It also sounded like a system that would take away a quieter, steadier right. The right to refuse a run that would make a father miss a child's recital. The right to a guaranteed week's pay when a match failed. He'd sat in too many coffee shops to mistake glitter for thoroughness. The startup did not arrive with hostility. It arrived as temptation. That is the most dangerous kind. Temptation is private and persuasive. It pries at small compromises until whole habits shift. Nicholas convened a series of informal breakfasts, no podiums, no press, where drivers could ask blunt questions without being selling targets. He asked the startup to present exactly how their algorithm handled constraints like school runs, elder care, and sudden mechanical failures. They produced code speak and dotted lines. Nicholas asked one plain human question that the slides never prepared them for. If your system causes someone to lose a week's wages, how will you make that person whole in a way that is immediate and unquestioned? It was the lever he always used. Translate abstract benefits into the arithmetic of a family's month. The startup offered insurance models, delayed credits, and a promise to improve the algorithm. Nicholas replied that promises that improve things later do not pay rent now. The room felt a little colder. Some drivers, still tempted by the bright numbers, muttered that innovation required risk. Others said softly that risk is fine when you have a safety net. The startup left with a polite handshake and a thin smile. They would return. That was inevitable. Rather than rage, Nicholas did the quieter thing he trusted. He made the cost of leaving explicit and immediate. He worked with Lucia to run the numbers that showed what immediate compensation would look like.
Like if an algorithmic error cut a driver's pay in half for a week. They presented 3 models to would-be partners. A model that required escrowed funds equal to 3 months of payroll per district. A model that required immediate bridge payments triggered by algorithmic displacement verified within 24 hours. And a model that mandated local governance votes before any algorithm could be allowed to push a driver's constraints aside. The math was simple and ugly. If you wanted to move fast, pay now. If you wanted our people safe, lock your promises into cash and code. Some investors objected, calling the escrow a drag. They loved the idea of models that scaled without friction. Nicholas's response was deliberate and small. He asked them to present a public example of a fast rollout that had not delivered a social cost. They fumbled. Politics and PR looked different up close. The investor with the smile put his suit on and left a check for the escrow anyway. Capital moves towards safety when the risk of headache outweighs the allure of speed. It is a pragmatic calculation, not a moral miracle. A different test arrived when a winter storm made the streets into slow rivers of slush. The platform's optimized routes, tuned for fair weather, started to misbehave. Algorithms do not feel cold or poor visibility or school closings. The morning lights showed drivers stranded, not because they could not work, but because their enforced schedules did not allow time for practical detours. The first grumbling call came at dawn, the kind a man makes when he is trying to find words that won't sound needy. Within an hour, there were a dozen such calls. The human override, Nicholas had insisted on it, glowed on the dispatch screen like a small, warm hearth. Rosa and Marco reacted exactly as he had trained them to. They established a triage line. They prioritized safety and family obligations. They accepted that the platform's metrics would wobble and be less pretty in the reports. They accepted, too, that the escrow would open its valves if pay discrepancies occurred because of the storm's impact. Money passed in ways that meant the driver who had to stay home with a sick child still received a bridge payment. The shopkeeper whose perishable goods were delayed received a small emergency granting fund to cover payroll. The wretched truth of such nights is that someone always pays for delays. The better truth is that the community decided early that the people on the ground should not always be the ones to lose. Word trickled up to the bloodless offices, the kind where models are worshipped and abstractions are prized. The platform engineers did not balk at the fixes. In fact, many of them were relieved someone had put human sense where their code had been brittle. It was an odd alliance. Technologists who wanted their creations to be useful, and old-fashioned logisticians who wanted to keep people whole. They began in earnest to write constraints into the code. A simple check that asked, does this reassignment violate a driver's declared caregiving constraint? And if so, pause and flag a human to decide. It was not the end of algorithmic error, but it made those errors reparable rather than ruinous. These moments of repair built confidence and also attracted new complications. A new regulatory push in the city proposed standardized delivery windows aimed at reducing daytime congestion. It sounded like an administrative improvement until someone pointed out it privileged well-capitalized hubs that already had night facilities. Small operators would find certain hours closed to them, squeezing margins that were already thin.
Nicholas spent a long afternoon with a city aide over papers and coffee, translating the administrative language into human timetables. Who would be affected, how, and in what week would unpaid rent appear? He insisted on an amendment that created a carve-out for micro-operators for a phased period, and he demanded resources to help those operators upgrade if needed. It was, again, the same method. Make the policy speak the language of consequences. Not every fight was a policy battle. Some were personal and just as telling. A longtime supplier who had always trusted Nicholas's word found himself facing a bank notice after a misfiled invoice. He came to the small back room where Nicholas kept his ledger of names and confessions and laid the panic out in plain terms. Nicholas did not grandstand. He made the calls he had kept in his head, an old contact at the bank, a deferred payment plan, a small loan from the escrow's microcredit arm, and an agreement to tighten invoicing practices. The supplier's relief was quietly deep. He ate dinner that night without worrying about whether his bills would crush him in the morning. To most, it was an unremarkable kindness. To the neighborhood, it was part of the architecture that kept mornings intact. The apprentices, learning these ropes, began to see the work as a craft, not a crusade. Marco learned not only where to reassign trucks, but how to phrase the reassignment so a driver felt respected rather than ordered. Lucia turned prosaic accounting into social intelligence. By tracking which shops cycled late payments most often, she could suggest micro-interventions, small advances, modest credit lines that kept trust alive. Rosa grew into the person who could sit with two angry men and make both feel like the room had heard them. They made mistakes. They also fixed them. Nicholas was not a father god. He was a teacher of habits. Repeatable, boring habits that, when performed enough, changed outcomes. And yet, temptation never died. The startup returned with a different pitch and a sweeter-sounding price. A few drivers clicked, some left. Nicholas let them go without drama. He would have preferred their company, but not at the cost of the whole. Those who stayed learned the value of structure, the escrow, the manuals, the right to refuse a run that would break a family's rhythm. Over time, this muscle attracted a particular kind of worker, one who wanted steadiness and dignity rather than the ephemeral thrill of bonus checks. That, Nicholas thought, was a good kind of quality control. There were nights he still walked the route to the seawall, though less often than before. The harbor's quiet taught him patience in his youth. In his middle years, it taught him the patience that comes from watching things take shape because others are tending them. He no longer carried all the burden. That was the point, to build a practice that outlived a single person's habits. As spring thinned the fog and the city's schedules smoothed again, a new door opened, an unexpected one. A neighborhood coalition from across the river heard about the escrow model and the human override protocol and asked if Nicholas would advise them. They did not want to copy his voice, they wanted to learn the habit. He hesitated only a moment. Teaching a practice can spread its virtues and its vulnerabilities, but not teaching keeps it forever fragile. He agreed to visit, to listen, and to help them build their own small ledgers. He traveled for a weekend with Lucia and Marco, two people who had grown into the roles he had once carried alone. They sat around a worn table in a community room and listened. The visitors were hungry not for techniques alone, but for the way to make those techniques ordinary. Meetings that did not require drama, a culture that insisted on repair, and escrow that was not charity, but insurance. Nicholas spoke less than he used to. He asked more. He asked who the visitors listened to and how they counted the cost of a missed payroll. He asked whether they would commit, in iron, to pay a fraction of the escrow themselves rather than rely on outside capital alone. People in the room nodded, surprised at how hard it was to answer simple questions about responsibility. When they left, Nicholas felt the slow satisfaction of seeing a habit begin to spread. The city is a network. Practices that protect one neighborhood can protect many if spread carefully. He trusted the apprentices at home to manage the neighborhood's day-to-day, and he trusted the models he had spent years building, pilot, measure, repair, to be taught again. That confidence did not make him complacent. New threats would arrive in some other form. Technology would change, policies would bend, and men of capital would circle like birds, aware of a feeding ground. But the muscle that had been built, the daily rituals, the escrow, the human override, the apprentices who could make small repairs, had changed the baseline. The city's mornings were less likely to be taken by surprise. That, for Nicholas, was the kind of victory worth the patient work. One evening, as they closed the hub's small meeting room after a long day of drafting a new set of protocol amendments, Rose, now as steady as any elder, caught his eye and smiled in a way that meant
The habit had stuck. Marco shrugged nothing, and Lucia put her pen down with the quiet flourish of someone who had solved a problem. Nicholas watched them and felt a small, private relief. He had not built a monument, he had built a practice. It is the difference between pages in a book and a living language. He walked home under a sky that had the slow blush of spring and felt the ledger in his head as a kind of map. Names, small debts, the hours certain men preferred, the times a shop closed for prayer. He had placed himself where decisions passed through, not to command them forever, but to make sure when a decision touched a life, it did not break it. The next chapters would bring bigger choices, deals that tempted the neighborhood with scale, politics that promised quick civic wins, and new technology that insisted it knew better than people. He would face them as he always had, with questions that made the abstract look like a family's month, and with a stubborn insistence that growth without repair was not progress, but displacement. He folded the day into his pocket, and for once let himself sleep without the small prickle of dread. The machinic parts he had oiled hummed softly. The apprentices could handle the night calls. The harbor's light blinked far off and steady. He slept aware, not anxious, and that felt, in its way, like another kind of quiet victory. The summer tightened into a long, slow heat, and the neighborhood's new rhythms were no longer novelty, they were habit. That habit did not arrive by decree. It arrived because Nicholas kept showing up, because the apprentices kept doing the small, sensible things he had taught them, and because the people who did the work each morning saw the difference between a promise that meant nothing and a promise that bought a week of rent when a route collapsed. Part of the work was subtle, sitting in rooms where people talked about markets and insisting gently that they translate their graphs into concrete human arithmetic. Part of it was practical and demanding, standing in the hub at dawn when the traffic was the worst, helping a driver who'd misread a dispatch, calling a supplier to clarify a manifest so that a bakery could avoid a ruined shift. None of these acts sought applause. They were stitches in an everyday life. But as the stitches multiplied, something noticeable happened. Fewer calls at 3 in the morning, fewer bitter notes left at counters. The neighborhood felt less like a brittle set of dependencies and more like a net that caught people before they fell. One bright morning, a man who carried glossy decks and a pleasant voice arrived with another pitch. He represented a growing national chain that wanted to fold local routes into a larger network. On the surface, he spoke the language of convenience: better pay for drivers, predictable contracts, access to new clients. The words had weight. They sounded good in the kind of room where investors gathered, the kind of room that liked decisions presented as windows of opportunity rather than choices with consequences. Nicholas listened with his usual quiet attention. He had learned that the shape of a question reveals a truth just as much as the shape of an answer. When the man finished, Nicholas asked simply, "If a driver loses pay because of an automated reassignment, how quickly will you make them whole, and who signs that check?" The man, used to talking in generalized promises, tripped. He produced a model that promised to be responsive. He did not produce the name of the person who would sign the check at 2 in the morning. In the corner, the apprentices listened as if this were a lesson they had rehearsed, and Nicholas felt that small satisfaction of having taught them what to look for. The chain's representative returned to his offices, and within a week came back with legal language and a slightly thinner smile. He had been required to propose an escrow provision large enough to cover 3 months of payroll in any district before he could move forward.
That concession changed the tenor of the conversation. It forced a negotiation over cash, not just PR. Investors hate cash tied up where it can sit idle. They hate it because it is real and unforgiving. At the same time, guarantees that are real tend to be cheaper than the political and reputational costs of breaking a community. A few investors grumbled, a few left the room, but the chain's man stayed and signed. Preliminary agreement, not because he wanted to, but because Nicholas had named what counted. The next test was a different animal: politics. A city official announced a smart city initiative that sounded like a blessing: grants, clean tech, and a promise to reduce delivery congestion by enforcing new delivery windows. Modern governance, the press called it. Modern governance often looks like common sense until you ask, who suffers in week one? The new delivery windows favored hubs with nighttime capacity. They privileged scale. That meant micro-operators who'd built their businesses on early morning deliveries, on credit from a friendly supplier, would face new constraints they could not afford. Nicholas spent afternoons in municipal offices, not grandly, but with a keen focus on phrasing. He insisted that any policy include a phased transition and funding for micro-operators to adapt, either by upgrading storage capacity, getting access to rotating cold trucks, or by participating in guaranteed local hiring clauses with the new hubs. Bureaucracies listen to structured proposals that show clear consequences. They listen less to moral grandstanding. He translated the policy's administrative language into payroll arithmetic and presented scenarios, 3 realistic ones, from the most optimistic to the most likely to go wrong. Officials, who liked narratives with clear metrics, adjusted the initiative. They added a pilot window and a fund for small operators. It was bureaucratic, and it was effective. Not all pressure was external. The neighborhood's own success began to attract attention from within its perimeters. Some younger operators, staring at the improved numbers and hearing the occasional investor boast, grew impatient. Why keep constraints? They asked. We could scale faster, make more now. Their argument was persuasive in a certain register. Money can fix many problems. Nicholas answered patiently, because his work was not to rebuke, but to instruct. He asked them to imagine a month where the algorithm misfired during holiday traffic. He asked them to list, by name, the people who would be most exposed and how long it would take to make them whole. Many could not answer with specificity. The conversation changed when they had to speak names instead of possibilities. One evening, a young operator named Daniel cornered Nicholas outside the hub and asked bluntly whether he thought ambition and caution were eternally opposed. Daniel had grown up in a neighborhood not unlike Nicholas's, but with fewer buffers. "Can't we have both?" he asked. Nicholas placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder and answered with a quiet truth. "You can have both if you accept that someone must hold the cost when things break. If you don't want to carry that cost, then your gains will be paid from somebody else's mornings." The answer did not satisfy the impatient, but it helped seed a habit, to attach a name and a price to every risk. The apprentices worked in the middle of these arguments, like seamstresses mending a garment as it was worn. Marco kept improving the driver interface so that human flags were obvious and easy to act upon. He built an icon that lit up when an automated route threatened a declared constraint, and he shortened the human response time by training a roster of on-call mediators. Lucia codified the escrow's trigger language, turning vague promises into crisp checks, verifiable missed payroll, audited displacement beyond a percentage, sudden and documented supplier collapse. Rosa, whose diplomacy had become a soft art, sat in meetings as a human translator between the hard numbers and the messy lives those numbers referenced. Together, they made the system less brittle. Then came one of those storms that feel small on the radar until you're inside its first hour. A summer thunderstorm swelled into a flash flood across a low-lying corridor the platform often routed through. Sensors reported road closures and slowness. The algorithm rebatched runs at an alarming rate, sucking drivers into longer, riskier journeys in the name of keeping utilization high. Calls began to come in. A driver stuck under waterlogged overpass, a shopkeeper whose stock wouldn't arrive, a parent missing a hospital visit because a run had been reassigned. Panic is contagious, and it can move business decisions faster than reason. The human override, the small, careful thing Nicholas had insisted on, became the neighborhood's most important tool. Rosa activated the triage protocol. Marco rerouted drivers through longer but safer roads. Lucia openly escrowed for immediate relief to drivers who had lost wages due to the flood's impact. Nicholas spent the day making calls, not dramatic ones, logistics calls, phone calls to mechanics, small favors that had been repaid in the past and which now returned like a quiet tide. The platform's engineers, watching the flood's chaotic data, thanked the team for the human flag policy. Their code had failed at scale, but the human system caught it. The flood did not become a catastrophe. It became, instead, a test that proved the scaffolding worked when the weather turned. The aftermath was instructive. The flood's data fed into the platform's learning models. Engineers integrated weather penalties into route optimization. Brokers who had once dismissed the escrow produced newfound gratitude in quiet corners. A few drivers who had been tempted by quick money offers decided the neighborhood's guarantees were worth staying for. The victory was not glorious, it was mechanical and durable. That kind of success is hardest to coronate because it looks like normal life resuming rather than drama resolved. But Nicholas understood it as proof. Systems can be human when humans insist they be so. Success, however, attracted another complication, the question of replication. A coalition from another borough had watched what the neighborhood had built and wished to copy it. That request pleased Nicholas. The arc of his work had always been to build something teachable. But replication scares him because context matters. What works in one place fails in another if the social fabric is different. He agreed to advise, but with caveats: pilots, listening tours, local escrow seating, and a year of mutual audits. The coalition agreed. They wanted the muscle, not a polished pitch. Nicholas dispatched Marco and Lucia to help, and they returned with stories about how local credit cultures differed and how different the meaning of guarantee sounded when landlords were more predatory or municipalities less willing to fund transition. Replication required humility. It was not a one-size-fit. Personal life continued in parallel with the policy work. A small but steady series of injuries and illnesses reminded Nicholas in private ways why he did what he did. A driver's child fell ill, and the family needed urgent funds. Nicholas arranged support through the escrow and a network of small loans. A baker had a heart scare and could not stand the oven for a week. An apprentice stepped in and coordinated temporary staffing. These were private stories that did not make the papers, but which sustained Nicholas's belief that systems are measured by their responses when someone's life tilts. By autumn, the neighborhood's approach had become an odd kind of argument in the city. It was not anti-technology, nor was it anti-capital. It championed the idea that innovation must be married to enforceable repair. There were policy papers that cited their model, cautious investors who began to ask for escrow clauses as standard practice, and a few tech teams that built human override features as default. The momentum changed the language of meetings. Where people once argued only about margins, they now discussed escrow mechanics and human flags. That shift was quiet and powerful. Nicholas, as the habits took hold, began to think about his own succession, not as an exit, but as a distribution of responsibility. He had no desire to vanish into irrelevance. He wanted the practices to be ordinary enough that his absence would not break them. He started mentoring a wider group, not just the apprentices, but others who could lead the oversight boards and the triage desks. He taught them the ledger of small promises he kept in his head: who to call for a spare truck, who will lend a driver money for a week if a bridge is down, which clerks expect morning notice and which accept afternoon texts. He taught them how to ask the human question at the heart of every proposal: who pays when it fails? There are people whose reputations are built on spectacle, and there are those whose reputations form quietly through the steady accrual of small necessary acts. Nicholas had chosen the second. By the time autumn light thinned into the gray of approaching winter, the neighborhood no longer depended on a single man's memory. It had procedures, audits, replenished escrow, and a cadre of people who could ask the right questions and act quickly when the morning needed saving. He did not imagine the future as a place of comfort. He saw it as a place of preparedness. New technologies would arrive, investors would shift tactics, and politicians would adjust their priorities. But he took comfort in one clear fact. The neighborhood had learned to demand that progress be accountable. That demand sounded modest, almost stubborn. It was, he knew, also the most powerful thing you can teach a community: to name what matters and to bind people to their promises with legal teeth and human judgment. On a cold evening toward the end of the season, Nicholas walked for the first time in months without prescriptive checklists. The apprentices were running the routines, and children played in a park that smelled of chestnuts. He stopped at a small window and watched a baker knead dough as if the motion could mend the world. A driver passed by with a lullaby on his lips, a child asleep in the front seat after a long day. The public life of the neighborhood was, in that quiet way, functioning. He sat on a bench and allowed himself one small, unguarded thought: that he had not only preserved mornings, but taught others to protect them. The ledger in his head was no longer a solitary archive. It was a shared map other hands could hold. That, more than anything, felt like an inheritance. Tomorrow there would be another meeting and another pitch. There would be policy debates and technical fixes, and the usual small failures. But he had built a habit into the neighborhood's muscle. The habit of asking the human questions before the numbers. That habit would be the story's thread into the next chapter, where bigger deals, political wins, and new platforms would test whether a practice, once spread, could resist the centrifugal forces of speed and shiny promises. For now, he breathed the cold air, felt the day settle, and let the quiet of a job well tended settle into him like a good coat. The cold that winter cut at the edges of things, but the neighborhood had grown sturdier in ways that made the cold feel less sharp. The frameworks Nicholas had helped stitch into place, escrows, human overrides, local governance, had teeth now. They had been tested not once but several times, and each test left them marginally more useful and marginally less fragile. That is what steady work does. It turns emergency procedures into habit, and habit is harder to erode than a single act of courage. Spring brought new pressures, the kind that arrive with polite smiles and glossy slides. A consortium of regional distributors proposed a streamlined model that, they promised, would bring more clients, cleaner docks, and better margins to everyone involved. It was an appealing picture: fewer trucks idling on narrow streets, a modern hub with heated bays, and a hotline that would route urgent shipments in minutes. To many ears, it sounded like the solution they'd been waiting for. To Nicholas, it sounded like another design problem, one that needed to be translated into the arithmetic of people's months. He convened people the way he always had: small rooms, coffee, a plain stack of papers. He asked the consortium to show not slides, but scenarios. Name a week and trace the human consequences if a key route failed that week. The consortium produced policy buzz and pilot data, and then a lawyer who could make any friction look like a solvable engine. Still, the offer required capital and scale, and that meant that the neighborhood's local levers might be pressed in ways that made the morning rituals brittle. A debate followed that was harder than earlier ones, because it was not only about money, it was about identity. Some shopkeepers welcomed the idea of cleaner docks and better scheduling because it meant less worry about spoilage and more time for family. Some drivers were tempted by the promise of higher-paying runs and steadier hours with a recognizable brand behind them. Others feared that the consortium's contracts would centralize hiring decisions and reassign routes in ways that would put small proprietors at risk. The escrow might cushion a fall, but the cultural loss of local credit and neighborly reputation could be harder to recoup. Nicholas did what he had always done: insist on naming the cost and putting mechanisms in place to pay it up front. He proposed binding conditions that the consortium first treated as negotiation theater: job guarantees for a fixed transition period, legally enforceable hiring preferences for local drivers, an expanded escrow to cover not just payroll, but also credit lines held with local suppliers. and independent audits to verify that promised efficiencies did not coincide with waves of displacement. He also insisted the governance board include local representatives with veto on certain operational changes for the first 2 years. Some investors disliked the friction. "You'll never scale with these tags on you," a suited representative told him bluntly. Nicholas replied with a kind of arithmetic he preferred. "Scale without those tags is fragile. Fragility costs more than the friction. You can either pay now or pay 1,000 small ways later." The representative left thinking the math unpleasant. He did not leave angry, but many men of money leave opportunities the same way storms leave branches. The consortium either accepted the clauses or had to walk. They negotiated, they shaved language here and there, and gradually the deal was rewritten to be enforceable in the concrete, not only in principle. The contracts were signed not with champagne, but with a public hearing and a ledger that city aides could use to check compliance. The hub opened with a modest ribbon cutting, a mayor, a camera brigade for a local news segment, and a crowd that contained both skepticism and cautious hope. The hub was cleaner and quieter than the old loading yards, and on some mornings it made neighborhoods breathe easier. On other mornings it created new frictions, longer commutes for certain drivers, a paperwork backlog for small operators who had to update systems to comply with centralized inventory. The escrow was used in small ways that prevented scarcity from becoming desperation. That was the point of the scaffolding, prevent the initial splinter from becoming a broken plank. Meanwhile, the platform continued to evolve. Engineers had started to take the human constraints not as annoying inputs, but as essential architecture. The code now checked for childcare flags and could be paused by a human moderator. It logged overrides so the oversight committee could audit them. Technology improved because humans insisted it should, and that was a kind of quiet victory. Still, technology also invited new kinds of leverage: data ownership, predictive allocation, and the sale of routing intelligence to larger players. Nicholas took a practical stance. Data should be jointly governed, with strict rules about resale and clear rights for the people whose labor generated it. He found allies among a new kind of engineer who believed systems should be accountable by design. There were also more delicate tests that had little to do with capital and everything to do with trust. A local supplier who had once been reliable found himself in trouble when a family obligation forced him to close for several days. He missed important paperwork renewal and faced license penalties. The bureaucratic machinery is not unkind by intention, but it is indifferent to the stakes of a single small business. Nicholas helped by connecting the supplier with a sympathetic clerk he had cultivated, a person who could expedite the paperwork in return for clear, documented steps. It required calling favors, yes, but it required something else more important: reminding the system that its rules were meant to serve people, not entrap them. Personal moments built into the narrative. An apprentice got married, and for the first time he thought of whether he would remain in the neighborhood or chase a job in a cleaner office. People make choices like this all the time, and systems change when those choices are respected. Nicholas understood that the life he had helped make possible needed to be attractive to the next generation, not just cheaper or more profitable, but humane and predictable enough to let people want to stay. He worked quietly to make family-friendly schedules part of the standard offers and to ensure retraining funds were real and accessible. A larger political pressure loomed when an upcoming municipal election turned efficiency into a slogan. Candidates promised modern logistics as if modernization were a single thing you could win by tweeting. Nicholas could see the script. A politician endorses the hub, photos are taken, and then the policy moves forward without the guardrails he'd fought for. He had learned the hard way. Lesson that power responds to incentives. Politicians want quick wins and photogenic moments. So he did what he always did: translate governance into accountable terms. He organized briefings for council members and arranged site visits that let politicians see the morning realities rather than hearing bullet points. Politicians, when they see a parent waiting for a child's lunch or a driver juggling two jobs, sometimes soften their timelines. He also mobilized modest public pressure, op-eds, neighborhood testimonies that framed moderation as political prudence rather than obstruction. The neighborhood's culture matured. People started to internalize the habits Nicholas had insisted on, translate abstract gains into named costs, demand escrowed commitments, and insist on local representation and governance. The apprentices became leaders in their own right, not because they wanted titles, but because they were good at the work. Marco took on a role coordinating cross-district routing, focusing on minimizing long-haul deadhead miles that drove up costs and drivers' fatigue. Lucia became the public face of the oversight desk, known for straight answers and quick audits. Rosa handled mediation with a calm that made men lower their voices and speak frankly. There were losses, small but real. A few operators chose speed over safety and relocated to districts where contracts were lighter and oversight thinner. Their choices were theirs, but their exits were also a cautionary sign. Market logic rewards risk if the risk is privatized. Nicholas felt the absence of some of those people, friends who had been tempted by brighter promises, but he did not mourn them in defeat. He saw their departures as part of the cost he had always named. If you choose short-term gain without a commitment to repair, you accept the possibility of losing community in the process. As the seasons cycled, a quieter strand of the work took hold: education. The neighborhood began to produce its own manuals, plain, useful guides for local governance, for escrow administration, for human override protocols. They held workshops for neighboring communities and city departments. The manuals were not grand theory. They were checklists and sample clauses and templates, useful, parsable, and portable. Someone in municipal procurement told Nicholas, almost as an aside, that these practical documents were more valuable to staffers than the grand policy papers they were used to receiving. People who operate systems live by templates that work, not by manifestos. One night, after a long week of negotiations, Nicholas found himself in the small kitchen he had used since his youth. The ledger of names sat in the corner, now joined by a growing stack of policy binders. He ran a finger along the spines and felt a quiet satisfaction that had less to do with pride and more to do with relief. The relief of a man who had learned how to make promises that could be kept and who had taught others to insist that promises be legally binding and human-facing. He thought of the apprentices, of the drivers whose children went to better schools because pay rules were steadier, of the bakers who could plan menus without fear of sudden supply collapse. He also watched for complacency. Habit is a muscle that grows weak without exercise, and the forces that preferred speed had not disappeared. There would be new platforms, new investors, new policies that would test the neighborhood's muscle. Nicholas took comfort in the fact that the muscle was not only his, it belonged to a cadre now. People who could ask the right question, who could verify claims, who could cook a replacement loaf in an emergency. That shared capacity, he thought, was the real inheritance. The part of the story that closed there did not end in fireworks or finality. It ended in a small, steady scene. The hub's lights humming as drivers returned from late runs, a young apprentice explaining escrow triggers to a council aide, a mother picking up warm bread for her children. Nicholas walked to the seawall a little later, watched the river carry a pale moon, and felt a quiet knowledge settle. The work had shifted from being his alone to being practice that others could perform. That was both a relief and a responsibility. The responsibility to keep asking the small, stubborn questions that make systems humane. The pressure that followed did not arrive with raised voices or obvious threats. It arrived as convenience. New set of tools rolled quietly into the hub, software updates that promised to smooth friction. dashboards that translated human movement into clean lines and color-coded certainty. The tools were not malicious, they were elegant. They reduced waiting time, predicted bottlenecks, and suggested route consolidations that looked brilliant on screens. For a while, everything seemed to glide. Nicholas had learned to be suspicious of glide. He watched the way people reacted to the dashboards. Younger managers trusted the graphs instinctively. They spoke about confidence intervals and acceptable variance as if those phrases could tuck a child into bed or explain a missed birthday. The older hands listened and nodded, but waited for the first real disruption before forming opinions. Nicholas waited too, not because he doubted the tools, but because he knew what smoothness often hid: fragility just beneath the surface. The first sign came not as a failure, but as a subtle narrowing. The software began to recommend fewer backup drivers per route. It made sense mathematically. Idle time looked wasteful, redundancy inefficient. But redundancy, Nicholas knew, was the invisible scaffolding that kept people upright when weather, illness, or bad luck arrived. He asked for the recommendation logs and studied the language. The system was not eliminating backups, it was deprioritizing them. A small change, easy to miss, dangerous if left unquestioned. He called a meeting, not a dramatic one, just a working session with Marco, Lucia, Rosa, and 2 engineers who had grown comfortable enough to speak honestly. Nicholas asked them to walk through a single scenario, a winter flu wave that sidelined 10% of drivers for a week. The dashboard adjusted, the lines wavered, and the margins thinned alarmingly fast. The engineers frowned. The model had assumed normal distribution of absences. Illness, it turned out, did not respect neat curves. The fix was not complicated, but it required humility. They adjusted the software to treat redundancy not as inefficiency, but as risk insurance. They hard-coded minimum backup thresholds that could not be overridden without human approval. It made the dashboards a little uglier. Nicholas liked that. Systems that look too perfect tend to lie. Around the same time, capital began to circle again, this time dressed as partnership. A large logistics firm proposed a minority investment that would accelerate innovation while leaving local governance intact on paper. The term sheets were clean, the valuations flattering. Some in the neighborhood felt flattered too. Being wanted can feel like validation, especially after years of being ignored. Nicholas read the terms slowly, then asked Lucia to do the same without discussing them. When they compared notes, both had circled the same paragraph, a clause that allowed temporary operational control during periods of extraordinary market volatility. The phrase was vague enough to be useful and dangerous enough to matter. Extraordinary volatility could be declared by the investor. Temporary control could last as long as profits were threatened. Nicholas did not accuse, he asked questions. What defined volatility? Who declared it? What protections remained for payroll and credit during that period? The investors answered smoothly, confidently. Too smoothly. Nicholas countered with a rewrite. Volatility would be defined jointly, operational control would remain local, and escrow protections would become automatic rather than discretionary during any declared emergency. The room cooled. One investor leaned back and said, "That limits flexibility." Nicholas replied with a sentence that had become his compass. Flexibility for whom? The deal stalled. It might die. Nicholas accepted that possibility without regret. Some capital is too impatient to be useful. Internally, another challenge emerged: fatigue. The people who held the system together were human, and humans grow tired even when their work matters. Marco had begun skipping meals. Rosa took calls late into the night. Lucia's notebooks thickened with annotations that hinted at stress. Nicholas saw it and recognized the danger. Burnout is quieter than collapse, but just as destructive. He insisted on a change that felt radical to some. Enforced rest, rotating on-call schedules, mandatory time off after crisis weeks, cross-training so no one person carried irreplaceable knowledge.
Slowed response time slightly, but made the system survivable. Nicholas reminded everyone that systems built on exhaustion are debts waiting to come due. The neighborhood adjusted. People grumbled, then adapted. Apprentices stepped into new roles. Mistakes happened and were corrected. Trust deepened because responsibility was shared more evenly. Then came the test that would quietly decide everything. A sudden regulatory change at the federal level disrupted a common shipping classification. Overnight, paperwork requirements changed. Containers stalled. Routes backed up across districts. Panic buzzed through industry channels. Some hubs shut down temporarily. Others pushed costs downward, letting drivers and small operators absorb the shock. Nicholas activated every layer of the system. The escrow opened immediately for affected payrolls. Lucia's desk verified claims within hours, not days. Marco coordinated reroutes that favored safety over speed. Rosa handled communications, explaining clearly what was known, what wasn't, and when updates would come. The human override system paused algorithmic reshuffling that would have worsened the chaos. The neighborhood moved slower than the most aggressive operators, but it moved together. For a week, the work was relentless. Phones rang, tempers flared, but no one missed rent. No one lost a week's pay. Shops adjusted hours instead of closing. Drivers rested when needed. The system bent and did not break. Outside observers noticed, not loudly, but with a recalibration of assumptions. Journalists wrote cautious pieces about resilient logistics. City officials asked for briefings. Even some investors who had walked away returned with quieter questions and better terms. When the paperwork bottleneck finally cleared, the neighborhood emerged tired but intact. That mattered more than any quarterly report. Nicholas stood one evening at the hub entrance as trucks rolled out under a pink-streaked sky. He felt the weight of years settle into something like clarity. The work had never been about winning arguments or proving a philosophy. It had been about one simple thing, making sure that when the world shifted suddenly, ordinary people were not the shock absorbers. He knew the system was not perfect. It never would be. There would be new tools, new temptations, new crises shaped differently than the last. But the habit was strong now. People asked the right questions automatically. They demanded real guarantees. They knew where to go when something broke. As he turned to leave, Rosa caught up to him. "You know," she said, "people are starting to teach this without you in the room." Nicholas smiled, not broadly, but with a quiet satisfaction that reached his eyes. That, he thought, was the point all along. The letting go did not happen all at once. It happened the way good systems are retired, gradually, with checks, with backups, with an understanding that absence should never feel like abandonment. Nicholas began by missing meetings on purpose. Not the urgent ones, not the ones where a single wrong word could tilt a decision, but the routine ones, the check-ins, the follow-ups. He watched from a distance as Marco chaired discussions with a steadiness that had once belonged only to Nicholas. He listened as Lucia explained escrow triggers to a room full of city aides without glancing at her notes. He watched Rosa calm a heated argument by asking one careful question and then waiting long enough for the answer to arrive. Nothing collapsed. That was the quiet confirmation he had been waiting for. The system did not require his presence to function. It required the habits he had helped embed. Ask the human question, bind promises to real money, build redundancy before you need it, and never confuse speed with progress. Those habits had become instinct. They lived now in other people's hands. There were still moments when his name was mentioned, usually in passing. "Ask Nicholas," someone would say, and just as often, someone else would answer, "We already know how to handle that." Those moments pleased him more than any public recognition could have. They meant the work had moved beyond him. He redirected his attention to teaching rather than steering. He met with younger organizers from other neighborhoods, not to give speeches, but to listen and ask the same stubborn questions he had always asked. When they wanted templates, he gave them checklists. When they wanted
Inspiration, he gave them caution. If you build something that only works when you're in the room, he told them, you haven't built a system, you've built a dependency. At home, life softened. He cooked more. He walked longer routes without a phone pressed to his ear. He sat at the same coffee cart and listened to conversations that no longer involved him. The city felt larger when he wasn't trying to hold one corner of it together. One afternoon, a driver he barely knew stopped him on the street. The man thanked him, not for a favor, not for a job, but for something harder to measure. When things go wrong now, the driver said, I don't feel alone in it. Nicholas nodded, unable to improve on that truth. The final test came quietly, as final tests often do. A major investor proposed a sweeping partnership that would have undone many of the safeguards if accepted too quickly. The offer was lucrative. It arrived with urgency and flattery. Years ago, it would have landed on Nicholas's desk and demanded his full attention. This time, it was handled without him. The oversight board reviewed the terms, the escrow clauses were examined, the human overrides were defended. The deal was rejected politely and firmly, with a counterproposal that preserved the neighborhood's core protections. The investor declined and walked away. The neighborhood remained standing. Nicholas learned about it days later, over coffee, as if it were ordinary news. That was when he understood that his work was finished. Not because the challenges were gone, but because the response to them no longer depended on him. That evening, he returned once more to the seawall. The harbor lights flickered on, one by one, the way they always had. Boats moved in and out, carrying things that mattered to people he would never meet. He watched until the lights became small, until distance softened urgency into perspective. He thought about the lesson he had learned long ago, that loud lives burn out, but careful ones endure. That systems built for people must be willing to slow down for them. That dignity, once protected, becomes contagious. Nicholas Corozzo did not leave behind monuments or slogans. He left behind something quieter and stronger, a way of working that treated human lives as non-negotiable inputs, not acceptable losses. He left behind mornings that arrived without panic. He left behind people who knew how to ask the right questions and insist on real answers. When he finally turned away from the water and walked home, there was nothing unresolved tugging at him. The city would continue to change. Markets would rise and fall. Technology would promise new efficiencies. But somewhere, in a neighborhood that had learned to protect itself, someone would notice a small problem early, fix it without drama, and keep a promise without needing applause.